Welcome back. Now we will review Chapter 6, which will discuss the role of government in legislating business ethics. Now, some would argue that the government has no role here. Others would argue that without legislation, particularly enforcing the comply or pay philosophy, corporations would not behave ethically. We will look at 5 key pieces of legislation that were designed to discourage, if not completely prevent, illegal conduct within organizations. This chapter starts with a bit of an unusual quote from Otto von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany. People who enjoy eating sausage and obey the law should not watch either being made. Now, what the heck does that mean? Well, my theory is that we all know that while sausage may taste good, the process of making it is really a messy and sometimes disturbing process of combining interesting ingredients. The process of making and enforcing laws is almost as messy. It is trial and error and sometimes haphazard. While the intent of the law is usually clear, the process to enact the law may be fraught with debate and disagreement. Here are the 5 laws that we will discuss that have been enacted since the early 1970s. These have attempted to discourage or even prevent illegal conduct within organizations. They are the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977, the U.S. Federal Sentencing Guidelines for Organizations, 1991, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, 2002, the revised Federal Sentencing Guidelines for Organizations in 2004, and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act in 2010. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or FCPA, was introduced to more effectively control bribery, or less obvious forms of payment to foreign officials, by American publicly traded companies as they pursued international growth. Prior to the passage of this law, the illegality of paying bribes was punishable only through secondary sources of legislation. The Securities and Exchange Commission could fine companies for failing to disclose such payments under their securities rules. The Bank Secrecy Act also required the full disclosure of funds that were taken out of or brought into the U.S., and the Mail Fraud Act made the use of the U.S. mail or wire communications to transact a fraudulent scheme illegal. These were all secondary sources of legislation. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is enforced by the Department of Justice and the SEC. It combines all the secondary measures that were in place and focused on 2 key areas. The first was disclosure. The Act required corporations to fully disclose any and all transactions conducted with foreign officials and politicians, in line with the SEC provisions. The second was prohibition. The Act incorporated the wording of the Bank Secrecy Act and the Mail Fraud Act to prohibit the movement of funds overseas for the express purpose of conducting a fraudulent scheme. Now, the FCPA recognized that facilitation payments might be necessary. These were acceptable provided they expedite or secure the performance of a routine government action. Examples of routine government actions would include providing permits or licenses or other official documents to qualify a person to do business in a foreign country, processing governmental papers such as visas and work orders, providing police protection, mail pickup, phone services, and power and water supply, to name a few. Paying government officials to do such services is allowed. Outright bribery is illegal. Bribery is the payment of money or anything else to influence any foreign official in making the decision to award new or continuing business. Such decisions are not considered routine government actions, and such payments are illegal. If you refer to Figure 6.1 on page 112 of your text, you will see the distinctions between legal and illegal activities made in the FCPA. The U.S. Federal Sentencing Guidelines for Organizations, or the FSGO, was enacted in 1991. This requires that organizations police themselves by preventing and detecting criminal activities of their employees and representatives. In fact, this holds organizations liable for the criminal acts of their employees and agents. The penalties under FSGO include very precisely calculated fines, organizational probation, which sounds a bit strange, but it includes periodic reporting on the business financial condition to the court, unannounced examinations of financial records by a designated probation officer, kind of like a drug test, and reporting progress in the implementation of a compliance program. The FSGO includes an operational compliance program to bring the organization into compliance with their standards. I mentioned the fines that fines are very specifically defined. If an organization is sentenced under FSGO, the calculation of the fine is determined through a three-step process. First is the determination of a base fine, which factors in both the nature of the crime and the amount of loss suffered by the victim. Second is a culpability score, which is the calculation of a degree of blame or guilt that is used as a multiplier of up to 4 times the base fine. This score can be adjusted according to aggravating or mitigating factors. An example of an aggravating factor might be that high-level personnel were involved or tolerated the criminal activity. A mitigating factor might be that the organization had an effective program in place to prevent and detect violations of law and self-reported the offense to the proper authority. Step 3 is determining the final amount, which is the base fine multiplied by the culpability score. In particularly egregious cases, a judge can impose a fine set high enough to match all the organization's assets. This is called, interestingly enough, a death penalty. The FSGO was revised in 2004. There were 3 key changes. Companies were required to periodically evaluate the effectiveness of their compliance programs, with the assumption that there is a substantial risk that any program is capable of failing. The revised guidelines required evidence of an active promotion of ethical conduct rather than just compliance with legal obligations. And finally, accountability was more clearly defined in the revised guidelines. Corporate officers are expected to be knowledgeable about all aspects of the compliance program, and they are required to receive formal training about their roles and responsibilities. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act became law on July 30th, 2003, but was actually introduced in 2002. It was passed as a result of a series of corporate accounting scandals that had begun to dominate the financial markets and the media since 2001. Supporters praised this act as one of the most important pieces of legislation governing the behavior of accounting firms and the financial markets since the 1930s. Critics were very concerned about the mounds of paperwork required and the expense to small business from the need for independent auditors and stringent filing requirements. This is a list of the titles or sections of this act. While I will not cover them individually, your text does describe the significance of each section. Most of these sections directly relate to the examples of corporate wrongdoing that arose during the Enron scandal. As you should all remember, in September and October 2008, financial markets around the world suffered a severe crash, largely due to the aggressive lending to subprime borrowers. The American Insurance Group, or AIG, received over $150 billion in rescue funding. Lehman Brothers Holdings, a giant investment house, did not receive bailout funding and collapsed in 2008. While the Sarbanes-Oxley Act was supposed to prevent the recurrence of corporate malfeasance, it quickly became clear that the lessons from Enron remained unlearned. On July 21, 2010, the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act was delivered. This legislation was promoted as the fix for extreme mismanagement of risk in the financial sector. It created the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or the CFPB, within the Federal Reserve. It created the Financial Stability Oversight Council, or FSOC, which is empowered to act if a bank with more than $50 billion in assets poses a grave threat to the financial stability in the United States. And finally, the Volcker Rule, which limits the ability of banks to trade on their own accounts. This is meant to limit the ethically questionable practice of banks taking opposing positions to trades that they are simultaneously promoting to their clients. The Dodd-Frank Act was enacted with over 2,300 pages. The jury is still out as to the effectiveness of this legislation, since many of the requirements do not go into effect until this year. Well, that's it for Chapter 6. The assignments for this chapter will ask you to take a look at the Sarbanes-Oxley Act and Ponzi schemes. As always, if you have questions, please email me or post on our Questions, Issues, and Concerns discussion forum. I will be back for Chapter 7.